The sun hung low in the Montana sky, casting long, golden shadows over the empty roads. The world seemed to stretch forever, a vast, wild land that whispered stories of survival and solitude. The kind of land that held secrets, and in the quiet morning light, George Whitman could almost feel them stirring. His old Ford pickup rumbled along Highway 2, its engine grumbling like the bones of a much younger vehicle. George's hands, once steady from decades of caring for animals, now trembled slightly as he gripped the wheel. But his eyes, pale blue, sharp as a hawk's, saw everything. Every crack in the road, every shift in the wind, every heartbeat in the land. At nearly 80, he was no stranger to pain. The kind of pain that comes from loss. His wife, Martha, had passed 5 years ago, and the house felt empty without her. But the rescue station, that small, converted barn filled with makeshift enclosures and rescued animals, had been his refuge, his life's work. As George rounded a bend, something caught his eye. A pile of something, dirty, discarded, and odd. He thought it might be old blankets or trash, abandoned by someone who didn't care. But as he slowed the truck, a faint movement caught his attention. He squinted through the windshield. There, barely visible in the early morning haze, was a black and white muzzle, the unmistakable markings of a husky. His heart sank. George pulled over without hesitation, parking the truck on the side of the road. His heart raced, the weight of years of experience warning him that this was no ordinary sight. He stepped out, his legs creaking with age, and approached carefully. The dog lay on her side, her thick fur matted and filthy. Her chest rose and fell with labored breaths, but there was something else about her, something so wrong. Her body, the swollen belly, the stained fur. George's pulse quickened as he knelt beside her. He saw the tiny bodies scattered around her. 5 small forms, no larger than a fist. Dead, all of them stillborn. "Oh, sweetheart," George whispered, his voice breaking. The dog's intelligent brown eyes met his. They were filled with an emptiness that hit George like a punch to the gut. Grief. A kind of grief that seemed almost human. George ran a hand along her neck, his heart heavy with the weight of her loss. Whoever had owned this dog once had abandoned her at the most critical moment. His jaw tightened in anger. Whoever did this, they didn't deserve the gift of a heart like hers. But that was in the past. Now, George had a decision to make. George's mind raced. The dog could barely lift her head. She was on the brink of death, but something told him he couldn't leave her behind. "Come on, girl. Let's get you out of here," George muttered. He carefully lifted the dog, surprised by how light she felt, despite her size. She didn't resist. She seemed to understand that this stranger meant her no harm. Her brown eyes remained locked onto his, as if she were silently pleading for help. George carefully laid her in the cab of his truck, gently adjusting her in the seat as he turned the key in the ignition. "We'll call you Maggie," George said softly, looking at the dog. "You look like a Maggie to me." At the sound of the name, the dog's ears twitched slightly, the first sign of awareness she had shown since George had found her. He glanced at her again, a lump forming in his throat. She was so broken, so lost. As he drove toward his rescue station, the silence in the truck was only broken by Maggie's occasional whimper and the rumble of the truck engine. Her presence in the cab, so still, so lifeless, filled the air with an unease George couldn't shake. He felt the weight of her grief. When George arrived at the rescue station, he hurried to get Maggie settled in one of the recovery kennels. He couldn't help but glance back at her as he went to grab some supplies. But before he could fully settle her, the phone rang. George picked it up quickly. "George, I hate to bother you, but we've got a situation here," Beth Patterson, the local farmers market coordinator, said breathlessly. "Someone left a wooden crate behind the produce stands. There's something alive in it. Tom thinks it's a raccoon, but I'm not sure." "I'll be right there," George said, already grabbing his keys. He'd been through this before. Animals abandoned in boxes were rarely a good sign. The farmer's market was winding down for the day. Vendors packed up their vegetables and homemade crafts as George pulled in. Beth met him at the entrance, her face filled with concern. "Behind Miller's vegetable stand," she said, leading him to the back. "Tom found it when he was collecting the unsold produce. Someone just left it there like garbage." George knelt beside the wooden crate, his heart already sinking. The crate was rough-hewn pine, with gaps large enough to slip a finger through. He peered inside, expecting to see a raccoon, maybe an injured cat. Instead, his breath caught in his throat that a tiny bear cub lay inside, its brown fur still patchy, barely covering its pink skin. Its eyes were shut, and its breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible. George's experienced eyes immediately recognized that this cub was in trouble. It was too young, too fragile, to survive on its own. Without a word, George carefully lifted the cub from the crate. It weighed barely more than a kitten, and he could feel the heat drain from its tiny body. Beth stood behind him, her voice barely a whisper. "Can you save it?" George looked down at the cub, the weight of his experience pressing down on him. He didn't know, but he couldn't let this little life slip away. "I don't know," George murmured, "but I'm going to try." George rushed back to his rescue station, the cub wrapped in a heated blanket. His heart raced as he checked the cub's vitals. Every few minutes, the bear's breathing was weak, its body dangerously cold. The drive felt too long, the clock ticking down to what could be the cub's final moments. When George arrived, he set the cub gently in the incubator, starting in 4 line as quickly as he could. The room felt heavy, the tension palpable. Each second felt like a year as George focused intently on the tiny creature, willing it to survive. But nothing happened. The cub, whom George decided to name Barney, simply lay still, too weak to move. His body wasn't responding. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for some miracle that might never come. And then, something unexpected happened. George glanced over at Maggie's kennel. She had been lying there, still and silent since he brought her in. Her eyes had been clouded with sorrow, but something seemed different today. As George continued his work on Barney, he noticed that Maggie had raised her head and was watching him intently. She had been so quiet, so withdrawn, but now there was a spark in her eyes, something familiar. Could it be? George thought, with slow, deliberate movements. George opened Maggie's kennel and walked her over to the incubator. She didn't resist, but her movements were stiff. She lay down near Barney, her gaze fixed on him. For several minutes, nothing happened. The two animals, both broken in their own ways, just lay there. But then, as if on instinct, Maggie's nose twitched. She moved closer to Barney and sniffed at the cub's tiny body. That George's heart skipped a beat. That Maggie's eyes softened. Her instincts kicked in. For the first time since George had found her, Maggie moved with purpose. She gently nudged the cub, licking its tiny body with tenderness. Her maternal instinct had awakened from its grief-induced slumber. George stood frozen, his breath catching in his throat. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Maggie, a dog who had lost everything, was now acting as a mother to this orphan bear. In the following days, something remarkable happened. Maggie began to care for Barney as though he were her own. She licked him, groomed him, and stayed by his side, making sure his body temperature remained stable. Every whimper from Barney was met with an instinctual response from Maggie, a soft nudge, a comforting lick. Barney, who had been too weak to move, began to show signs of improvement. His eyes started to flutter open. At first, he barely reacted. But slowly, as if recognizing the warmth and love in Maggie's care, he began to respond. George couldn't believe what he was witnessing. The bond that had formed between them was inexplicable. A mother dog, a bear cub, both brought together by loss, and now healing together. One morning, George walked into the room and saw Barney standing on shaky legs, his tiny claws gripping the blanket beneath him. He was struggling, but he was standing. He was trying. Maggie, ever watchful, was right there beside him. She nudged him gently with her nose, as if to say, "You've got this." For the first time, George felt a surge of hope. Maggie taught Barney the ways of the wild, how to track, read the wind, and navigate nature. Their bond was growing stronger every day. Barney, despite his rough start, was learning quickly. He followed Maggie's lead, mimicking her movements. They began to go on walks around the property, Maggie leading the way and Barney trailing behind. It was as if Maggie were preparing him for the wild world that awaited him. George watched from a distance, amazed by their unspoken connection. Barney's first sign of independence came one day when he caught his first rabbit. Instead of eating it, he brought it to Maggie. His dark eyes glistened with pride as he presented his catch to her. Maggie sniffed the offering, her tail wagging. once an acknowledgement. Then, she leaned in and gave him a gentle lick across his forehead. It was a simple act, but to George, it was the clearest sign of the bond they had formed. As Barney grew stronger, he began to venture farther from the rescue station. At first, it was just brief absences, an hour here, 2 hours there. But soon, his explorations stretched into longer and longer trips. George worried, but Maggie seemed to understand that this was natural, even necessary. She would sit by the gate, watching the tree lean, always alert, but never anxious. She had done her part. Barney was ready to face the wild, even if that meant leaving her behind. The first night Barney stayed away overnight, George barely slept. The next morning, he found Maggie lying by the gate, waiting. When Barney finally returned, he brought a branch heavy with wild berries. He placed them before Maggie with the same careful pride that he had shown when he brought her the rabbit. Maggie sampled them delicately, her tail wagging in approval. Barney was still returning to the family that had saved him. As years passed, Maggie grew older. Her steps became slower, her fur grayer. George watched as she began to tire more easily. Her health slowly declined, and it became clear that time was running out. She could no longer manage the long walks around the property. But she still continued. Her morning ritual of checking the air for Barney's scent. One crisp autumn morning, Maggie passed away peacefully in her sleep. Barney stayed by her side for 3 days, never leaving her. The town held a quiet ceremony, honoring the dog who had saved a bear cub and changed the course of 2 lives forever. Barney, now a full-grown bear, stood silently by the tree lean, a son honoring his mother. Years later, Barney returned to the rescue station with his own cubs. He approached Maggie's grave with quiet reverence, showing his offspring the love that had been passed down from Maggie. George watched from his bench by the grave, feeling the weight of a story that would live on. Barney's visits had become less frequent, but the legacy of love that Maggie and Barney shared would never fade. The world had learned something from them, that love knows no boundaries, and sometimes, the most broken souls are the ones capable of the greatest healing.